I think Australia was right. I think it was timely. I think all of the information has in effect been fact-checked over and over by the Joint Investigative Task Force, and responsibility should be placed where it does lay.
Russia consistently denies any involvement. They do this on any number of issues, MH17, interference in political systems, murders, as we've heard tonight. How do you hold someone who's constantly denying these kind of things to account?
Well, Russia has a recent history of using events that have involved large numbers of innocent deaths in order to accomplish foreign policy goals. MH17 appears to just be the most recent example of that type of policy. You have to hold them accountable, even if it comes down to government sanctions. It comes down to private parties, such as the victims in this case, filing lawsuits against them and trying to obtain judgments from courts of jurisdiction. You never know what you're going to be able to do with those things, but there isn't an excuse for allowing them to conduct this type of policy and go without being challenged.
Former Prime Minister Tony Abbott here has said that we should go as far as expelling the Russian ambassador. Do you think that goes too far?
No, that's a decision, of course, that the Australian government has to make. But we're almost 4 years post-event, and so far, the two most interested and powerful governments with clean hands in the event, completely innocent, are the Australian government and the Dutch. The Dutch have been spearheading the Joint International Task Force investigating this as a criminal proceedings, and I am very pleased to see the Australians acting with such strength.
The joint investigation last week released their strongest evidence so far of Russian involvement. They were able to pin it down to a particular brigade, a Russian brigade. You've said that you've had this kind of information for some time. Have you been frustrated by how long it's taken to get this out into the public domain?
We have had the information and more, and I have to say that what the Dutch announced last week was what they needed to announce in order to make a public statement of responsibility. They have a criminal proceedings. They have a very high standard of proof in that criminal proceedings in order to hold the Russian Federation responsible. So I haven't been frustrated because I recognize how difficult their job is going to be to produce responsible individuals for criminal proceedings, and for that they need evidence which is almost beyond reproach. So even though videos, films, missile pieces, conversations intercepted, and those types of things have been available, and the conclusion has been discussed in private between authorities about Russian responsibility, they only acted when they had an open and shut case. And I'm not frustrated, I'm pleased. It gives great strength to our civil proceedings.
They do talk of having even stronger information that they haven't spoken of. If you are aware of that information, do you think it's going to be enough to bring a good, solid criminal case?
I think the question about the criminal case is whether the Russians will be forthright enough to produce the individuals they need, or whether the Dutch will be forced to try an empty chair. But yes, I am satisfied that there is a good deal of direct and circumstantial evidence which demonstrates that the Russians did this and that it was done with planning and deliberation.
You have said that only through a joint effort will the Russians be held accountable. What do you want to see? What do you mean by a joint effort?
There are a lot of different interests that have claims arising out of this event against Russia. There are private interests where the families have hired attorneys like myself and brought these claims in the European Court of Human Rights, which typically handles very high-profile political events. That is necessary. But we also need the strength and the authority of the nation states who have been directly affected. And again, I'm afraid that comes down to basically Australia, the Netherlands, and perhaps the UK, because they lost a number of people also, and of course recently had the event with the poisoning involved and treated that as if it were an act of war. So you need the strength diplomatically, you need the strength of criminal proceedings, you need to put all those together, and we should be cooperating, sharing information in order to maximize the amount of pressure that can be placed upon Russia to deal with acknowledgement of the event, to find some justice for the families, and yes, to find some compensation. But it really isn't compensation in this case. What we're asking for is punitive damages, which punish Russia for being a bad party in this, for being the murderers.
And as you point out, given the lower burden of proof in a civil case, would that not be the best course of option to get that punitive action?
I think it would put a great deal of pressure on Russia because they are already subject to sanctions. Individual Russians are subject to sanctions. Their industrial base is suffering because of those sanctions. And if they were suddenly faced with a judgment from a European court where they have exceeded to jurisdiction in the past, I think that would be a very effective case to accompany whatever diplomatic, whatever criminal proceedings Australia and Netherlands and the other states might choose to bring. I've been open and been advocating to both governments for some time that everybody who has an interest should be working together, because Russia is anything but your conventional defendant. The pressure has to be maximized.
What level of admission from Russia would satisfy you, do you think?
Well, it's a lot different question whether it would satisfy me or the families. I want them to acknowledge that their military acted across an international border with a powerful, sophisticated weapon and deliberately brought down what could have been foreseen or was known as a commercial airliner. They don't have to admit to motives, but I think there can only be one motivation. They were fighting a war in the Ukraine. They needed to gain an advantage politically in that war because they had not been able to do it openly. They had been fighting with hybrid war tactics, and they chose to give themselves an advantage by committing an act like this, such as they had done with the Georgians and the Chechens in the past, and then turning around and blaming it on their enemy. That gives them the high ground. That, of course, is just the opposite of what it did in reality.